Welcome back to the Western Bubble. My name is Dario and I'm here with Balder. And today we will talk about migrants in the United Kingdom being deported to Rwanda. Hi, Balder. Why are we talking about this topic today? Why are we talking about Rwanda and the United Kingdom?
Well, hi Dario, this has been a sad saga that's been occurring for a number of years now, where the UK has been desperate, or the UK government, I should say, has been desperately trying to essentially outsource asylum policy to Rwanda as a symbolic attempt to show the British population that they're keeping the evil foreigners out. Every couple of months, they seem to get closer to actually implementing the policy, and they have now claimed that they are very close to actually starting deportation flights. And this is a other step of a Western society showing its colors, showing how it is in decline and how it is fearful of outsiders and willing to basically forgo its own morality and common sense in order to cater to its darkest feelings.
And what are the facts?
The United Kingdom and Rwanda Migration and Economic Development Partnership is an immigration policy first proposed by the British government in April of 2022, whereby people from the United Kingdom identified as illegal immigrants or asylum seekers would be relocated to Rwanda for processing, asylum, and resettlement. The first flight for this plan received legal clearance from the High Court of Justice and was scheduled for the 14th of June 2022. A last-minute interim measure by the European Court of Human Rights led to the plan being halted until the conclusion of the legal action in the United Kingdom. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak vowed last week to begin detaining people promptly before deportation flights start within 10 to 12 weeks.
What is the bubble?
So with this policy, we have to be careful a little bit, right? A bit of a disclaimer. Both of us are deeply appalled by this policy and by the attempts of it. So we hope dearly for all of the listeners that we will not just be ranting about this, but that we actually manage to kind of look at the Western bubble perspective from all of this. But to get the ranting out of this way, let's talk about what's wrong with this policy. Just to summarize this again, in case it wasn't clear from the fact sheet, right? So someone arrives in the United Kingdom. They apply for asylum, or maybe they arrived not the proper way and they just crossed the channel, and now they are in the United Kingdom as an quote, right, air quote, illegal immigrant. And now, instead of being processed within the UK and giving their fair process there, they're being sent to Rwanda for all of this process to happen, right? So it could happen that you come from, I don't know, Syria, and you're seeking asylum in the United Kingdom, and suddenly you find yourself on an airplane to Rwanda, a place that you've maybe never, well, you didn't want to go, you maybe never heard about, and suddenly you're there. Um, that's quite frankly ridiculous.
It is absurd. And this is not even so much about Rwanda, right? It could be anywhere. This is not going to be an episode analyzing whether Rwanda is a nice country to go to or not, or whether it is a good thing to visit Rwanda. I've been to Rwanda, and it's a very well organized country. That's not what this episode is about. It's about the United Kingdom, a country that at least nominally prides itself on being morally righteous, on being a force for good in the world, um, does not allow people to come in and say, I need your help. I have been persecuted at home. If I go back home, I might be killed, or I might be arrested. My family has been killed or has been arrested. Please, can you give me a place in your society? This is the UK then saying to those people, we have no interest in having you on our soil. We are going to punish you by sending you to another country. And maybe at some point in the future, you can get back here, or maybe you will forever have to stay in that country, or maybe from that country, they will send you back home, depending on the procedure. It goes against everything that our Western liberal values espouse to be. It goes against everything our Judeo Christian religious roots have been emphasizing. Be kind to your neighbor, be welcoming to strangers. especially if those strangers have a traumatized past, if they come from a dark place and they need protection. The fact that we are entertaining this policy, the thought of this policy, let alone that it's actually going to be implemented very likely soon, is outrageous, and it says a lot about where we are as a Western society.
It's a big thing coming from the West, right? I mean, the place in the world that for the past 30 years in particular has been looking down on the rest of the world, whacking their finger, right? Saying that, oh, human rights and democracy, and this is how you need to do things. And there are certain things that, within these human rights that you cannot basically compromise. And then you have the United Kingdom basically sticking the finger to to those human rights that it always claims, and that to me is I don't know. It just makes me very angry, right? Because I mean, whenever we talk about the West, I mean, we both obviously feel very closely connected to the West, and it makes me quite honestly be ashamed to be part of this West.
Deeply, deeply ashamed. And there is no way that you as a British citizen, certainly not if you support somehow this policy, uh, that you as a British citizen can say, my country is a kind, welcoming country. This is the opposite of being kind and welcoming. This is the worst. To make it even worse, a lot of the asylum seekers, the people who try to escape persecution at home and who ask for help, who ask the UK to protect them, come from places where the UK's foreign policy has actively created the circumstances that led to the persecution, or at least have been involved in the history that led to that situation. Syria, Afghanistan. There were questions in Parliament last week uh, about the fact that a lot of the translators who worked for the British military in Afghanistan during the Civil War, so they supported the British military, now are being persecuted by the Taliban for being traitors, for working with Britain, will be eligible to be sent to Rwanda. So people who you used in your war in Afghanistan cannot now go to London and say, please help me, I am in danger of the Taliban. They are going to be sent to Rwanda. It is so morally corrupt, so devoid of any basic human standards that the fact that we're here now, that we are recording this episode, is a dark indictment of where the West has ended up.
Mhm. So on a personal level, both of us are pretty appalled. But apart from this policy is also incredibly hypocritical, right? I mean, so if this policy at least said, we don't like foreigners, we are currently scared, and there's very few resources, and people are struggling financially, and we don't have money to spend on foreigners and asylum and all of that. We would rather spend this in Manchester. Then at least that's honest, right? It's still something that I would disagree with, but at least that's honest. But no, to to kind of quote from some of the policy papers involved in this, to basically quote directly from the British government. So this is a policy paper called "Safety of Rwandan Bill Fact Sheet," and it was last updated on April 25th. There's a few passages that we would like to read out and comment on, simply because, I mean, if this, I don't know, as I said, if this was at least honest, I could live with it a bit better. But the fact that they are now saying, and I quote, "The overarching purpose of this bill is to deter dangerous and illegal journeys to the United Kingdom, which are putting people's lives at risk, and to disrupt the business model of people smugglers and who are exploiting vulnerable people." End quote. Also, it seems like the UK's government is very concerned about the safety of these people, right? Oh, because they want to protect them from this dangerous journey through, I don't know, maybe through the channel, right? But maybe maybe the far less dangerous option would be to just then welcome them with open arms. But no, you're not concerned about the safety of these people. You're just scared as a society, and you want to close off.
Of course, why do these people have to cross the channel on small, dangerous boats, being endangered by not just potential smugglers, but also the French and British coast guards Because Britain has consistently, over the past decades, made it almost impossible for an asylum seeker to actually, in a reasonable way, ask for asylum in London. You cannot just fly to London and say, I'm claiming asylum. It's almost impossible nowadays. So you have now you've pushed people into taking those small boats, just like, by the way, the European Union has done the same with the Mediterranean. You push them into endangering themselves, endangering their lives to come to your country and hope that somehow they can get a little bit of mercy from the society that they're asking protection, to whom they're asking protection. And now the government says, "Oh, yeah, no, it's what a shame. It's really we would love asylum seeker to help asylum seekers, but first we have to protect them against themselves, and we have to make sure that they don't endanger their lives on the channel." So, yeah, unfortunately, we now have to implement this Rwanda policy. It doesn't make any sense, and everyone knows it, right? Everyone knows this is hypocritical. Everyone knows that this is a self-created problem, a problem created on purpose by the British government, that doesn't want people to claim asylum in Britain in the first place. Yeah, it's infuriating. I don't know if we're going to be able to not rant anymore in this episode. It's going to be a ranty episode, Dario.
It will be, because the next section reads, and I quote, "Last year, 2023, 29,000 people have arrived in the UK by small boat. This compares to around 44,000 people at the same time in 2022, a fall of around a third. But we need to do more to fully resolve the problem and stop the business of smugglers and traffickers." I mean, see here within the same sentence, it's a complete contradiction, right? So first you're celebrating yourself for, haha, we have fewer outsiders arriving in our society. This is basically what we want to achieve, right? This is our message to our voters. But at the same time, right, we're the evil smugglers, right? We're protecting these 29,000 people from the smugglers.
Yeah. There's something very unpleasant about how these sentences seem to suggest this automatic criminal link, right? Basically connecting smugglers, traffickers, criminal behavior with people looking for support, help, protection in the UK. And that goes hand in hand with the way that we've started not really caring about why people come, refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, and not really having a conversation about, you know, what do we want? What do we want to do with strangers who are asking for help? It is basically all projected as an evil invasion of outsiders who are a problem for us, who are somehow dangerous to us. There's something criminal about them, there's something not quite right about them, and we have to keep them out. The whole language around this has become very, very ugly. When we talk about asylum seekers, the only thing that you can do to actually keep asylum seekers low, the numbers of asylum seekers low, is to make the world a better place. Because asylum seekers are not connected to what happens domestically in the UK. Asylum seekers are connected to violence around the world. And if the violence around the world and hardship around the world goes down, oppression goes down, then there will be fewer asylum seekers. If violence and oppression around the world goes up, there will be more asylum seekers. There's nothing the UK can do domestically to change that.
Let me be cynical for a second. I think there is something the United Kingdom can do domestically to change that. It's continuing the path they're currently on, basically wrecking the economy and making the UK as unpleasant to be in, because then I think people will choose other countries to migrate to rather than the United Kingdom.
That's actually an interesting point. So with the UK's policies of certainly over the past decade or so, the UK's reputation is suffering, and even though now British people still have this sense of, oh no, we are very attractive because we've got all those people wanting to come and live in our country, it is very clear that Britain is no longer seen as this paradise, if it ever was, by the way, but as this place where everyone wants to go. And it is seen as a bit of a dark and a bit of a weird place with Brexit, with this Rwanda policy, with their general behavior on the world stage. the world looks at Britain and says, actually, it feels a bit uncomfortable. Why would I want to live there? And I say this as someone whose wife is British, right?
Hmm. I mean, and I see this as well from a perspective where a lot of my friends and colleagues from university, very few of them have ended up in the United Kingdom, and every time they do, my initial reaction is, why? I'm so sorry, but why? Why would you go to the UK? I mean, it's yeah, London must be nice and everything, but it's incredibly expensive, and the wages aren't amazing. But yeah, I mean, so enough of why we wouldn't want to go to the UK in that sense, or why the UK is becoming less of an attractive place. Because the last quote I want to bring forward from this policy paper here is, and I quote: "The Prime Minister also announced that the UK government would introduce new legislation to enable Parliament to confirm that with the new treaty, Rwanda is a safe country." End quote. And the UK government did exactly that. And this is beyond outrageous, right? Because now we're going away from the humanitarian aspect of, okay, how moral is it to send asylum seekers to Rwanda or not? Now we're basically going full into the Western bubble. And one of my favorite episodes, right, the hollowing out of institutions that we've talked about previously, because here you have a UK court basically saying that, hey, Rwanda is not really a safe country from our opinion to send asylum seekers to. They might be in danger there, right? This is the UK court saying this, not us. And then the UK government has simply passed a law saying that, no, don't worry, it's safe.
Yeah. So this is exactly the opposite of how institutions are supposed to work, right? What you do is you set a set of criteria politically, legislatively, to decide what is safe and what isn't, and then you let legal institutions apply those criteria to check whether a country falls within that range or not. So you have a number of variables that you say, okay, if you pass these tests, then you're a safe country. And now we're going to see if Germany or Spain or the United States or China fall within those criteria or not. And if the answer is no, they don't fall within those criteria, then either you change the overall criteria in a long political process because you feel that they're a little bit too strict or a little bit this or a little bit that, or you accept the legal outcome. Instead, what the UK government has now done is that, yeah, okay, there are criteria for what makes countries safe, and the courts have said that actually Rwanda is not safe. We don't like that outcome because we really want to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. So now we're going to legislate specifically for Rwanda so that we can create a law that states Rwanda is safe, independently of any application of criteria, which is so destructive to the relationship between legislation and law. That's not it would be similar to saying, okay, we don't like this person walking down the street, but we can't really claim that he has committed any crime, but now we're going to introduce a law specifically for that person, saying that that person has committed a crime. And even though the legal institutions say that he hasn't, once we legislate, they have to accept our legislation and they have to arrest him. It doesn't make any sense. It is completely contrary to how a well-functioning democracy is supposed to work.
And now, apart from our personal feelings towards this law, right? That, I mean, it's morally for me appalling to do this. Is that it's hypocritical from my perspective. That it's hollowing out institutions. If we now look at it from a perspective of someone who wrote this law, right? So what do you want to do? You want to reduce the amount of asylum seekers and migrants that are arriving in your country. From that perspective, the law is also incredibly ineffective.
Yeah, it's hugely expensive per asylum seeker. It creates all kinds of legal, even just the cost over the past 2 or 3 years that have been the money that's been spent on lawyers, on legal processes, on political processes. That will continue because it's not as if once the first flight flies to Rwanda, then the legal discussions will stop. Legally, it's incredibly expensive. Politically, it's incredibly expensive. Financially, just to send people there, to pay Rwanda to have them there. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds for relatively small amounts of people involved. If I were a British taxpayer, I would be outraged about my government wasting money like this. There are so many more financially effective ways to deal with asylum seekers. This is pure symbolism. It is politics. It is not proper policy making. And the scary thing is that everyone knows it. Everyone knows that this is political symbolism and that it has nothing to do with effective domestic policy making.
Because this topic is believed to be a vote winner, right, during the next election. So, okay, people care about migration, right? It's a very emotionally charged topic for very good reasons. And people in general, right, because society is not doing well in the past few years. I mean, in the UK, particularly since Brexit and then COVID and so on, right? So there's a lot of problems we now see within the UK, and that I'm also deeply concerned about, because that means that people are struggling, right? People, 20% of all Brits, like they basically can't make it till the end of the month, financially. So you want to exploit these feelings as a vote winner, right? And that's something that I correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like a few years ago that wasn't possible.
No, this is something relatively new. Not so much the path of sort of projecting our fears and insecurities onto immigrants, right? That is a sort of a long-standing tradition that has gotten worse and worse in the West, but it goes back many decades. However, this idea that now there is a significant portion, maybe even a majority, within the British population and potentially even within Western populations in general, to support this kind of policy nonsense, because that's what it is, shows how deeply insecure the West has become, how terrified the UK population is of itself, of its place in the world, where the real challenges that the United Kingdom is facing are not being dealt with. In fact, it's getting worse and worse. Infrastructural problems, investment in education, in healthcare, in all those kinds of things, they're not being dealt with. And instead, politicians can get away at basically fighting anonymous outsiders, vulnerable outsiders, asylum seekers, people who are traumatized because of horrible histories that they've suffered through. These are the people that we choose to make our enemy in order not to have to deal with our actual real problems at home. And it is very, very concerning for someone who cares about Western societies, who wants Western societies to do well, to see the psychological trickery that we're playing with ourselves by basically making these poor asylum seekers the problem rather than actually facing the genuine, true problems that we have in our society.
Maybe we should invite a very old person onto this podcast soon. And with very old, I mean somewhere in their 80s or 90s, because what I sometimes struggle with is finding perspective, right? Historical perspective on current feelings within society. So if I look at how I have observed the world since I've basically been watching the news, right? There has been the financial crisis of 2008, then another crisis, a financial crisis of 2012, then kind of like the migration crisis within Europe in 2015. Then you had COVID. Now you have the war in Ukraine. You have the situation between Israel and Gaza. You have inflation. To me, it seems like the West has become very pessimistic about its own future in the last 5 years in particular, right? So there you have obviously COVID, the war in Russia and Ukraine, and inflation. And to me, it seems like the years before were not as pessimistic. Maybe that was just because I was even younger and the world was nicer back then. But I wonder, I mean, you can obviously answer this for like the last 20, 30 years. I mean, whether we have always been this pessimistic.
No, we clearly haven't, right? And I think regular listeners to our podcast will kind of know this by heart by now. The 1990s were incredibly optimistic. The 1990s seemed to, the gate towards the beautiful 21st century when everything was going to be amazing and great and the sky was the limit, economically, financially, the internet was coming, everything, the Cold War was over, everything was great. 9/11 happens, the war on terror becomes this weird kind of conduit catalyst of our own insecurities because all of a sudden we realized that we were a little bit too optimistic. Then the financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9 occurs, and we start sinking into this psychological darkness, and the West becomes depressed. Literally, in the sense that we know that more and more people are actually suffering mental illness, suicides are up, and all that. But also, as a society, is becoming insecure. We become inward looking. We start thinking about insider-outsider models, whereas the 1990s was all about joining the world and holding hands and singing Kumbaya together. Now, in the 21st century, it's about us building a wall against the evil outsider, whether the evil outsider is China or Russia or an asylum seeker, it doesn't matter. They are not us, and they are a danger to us. And now in 2024, it's clear that this is becoming worse and worse. It is a society on the decline. And if you look at it from a broad historical perspective, this kind of obsession and kind of ineffective policy making towards asylum seekers is the sign of a civilization that might be nearing its end, or at least might be nearing the end of its golden days.
Mm. It might be, right? I mean, regular listeners also know that I'm sometimes one for crazy theories. I think another sign of current society, right, being a bit depressed and wishing back the good olden days is fashion. Is because so many fashion trends are coming back from first the early 2000s, late 90s, but also the 70s and 80s. And it might be that this generation has no interest, aka my generation, has no interest in creating their own style and their own, right, cool life, because there's nothing cool about the current times, and we kind of all wish that we were living in the 70s, 80s, and maybe in late 90s.
Yeah, I that might be true. I am the worst person to ask about this. Anyone who knows me is that I'm the least fashionable person in the world. My theory is a little bit that if I wear the same clothes long enough, then at some point fashion gets back to my style, and I'm actually a trendsetter for 1 year. I mean, to be honest, there is interesting analysis in that direction, right? About how you can look at the behavior of a society, a generation, and extrapolate kind of their approach to the world and whether they think in optimistic terms, in creative terms, in hopeful terms. And fashion can often be a sign of that. Art can be a sign of that, right? Art shows very often where society is. Music, and generally, I think that there is a lot of signs of a society that no longer looks towards the future, that is no longer trying to invent a better tomorrow, but is desperately trying to cling on to some imaginary glory days from the past, with all the terrible consequences that are related to that. And this can also be seen in political discourse, right? Trump's Making America Great Again, referring to some past that never really existed, but not really talking about what would be a good future. What is the future we're looking forward to? What are we working towards? It doesn't exist in political discourse anymore.
What's the international relations context?
Let's take this away from the West for a second, and let's go into the international relations perspective here. Obviously, the reaction to this policy by the UK and basically what this agreement with Rwanda was met with a lot of criticism, also from the United Nations, if you ask me, Western institution. But it was very quickly that when this was proposed, that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was firmly opposed to this and basically believed it to be unlawful, impractical. And I mean, that tells you a little bit that if the UN, a Western product, is criticizing this, that maybe the West is losing a little bit of its moral authority.
Very clearly, because it set up these institutions during a time that it was building towards a better tomorrow, the second half of 20th century, it set it up in a optimistic fashion. The UN and the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in many ways, are optimistic documents, right? Saying this is our ambition that we as humanity want to achieve at some point in the future. And now the West itself is deviating from those institutions that it set up. And the result of that is that those institutions are no longer in sync with this kind of policy making. This Rwanda policy goes directly against the whole spirit of what the UN is about. It goes against the spirit of working together, of supporting each other, of protecting the vulnerable in society, of being kind to thy neighbor. Those kinds of things are now disconnected from Western attitudes. And it's not a surprise that the UN and the European Court of Justice and broadly the international global community is looking at this and says, hang on, I thought that we were supposed to be nice to each other. I thought we were supposed to protect the vulnerable. I thought that Christians always pride themselves on treating your neighbor as you would like them to treat you, those kinds of things. And now it seems that the West has become a completely different entity.
Another element of the international relations perspective is, I mean, we've looked at the West reacting to this, we've looked at the United Nations reacting to this, but what does Rwanda say about this? I mean, obviously, the President Kagame, he's fine with the policy. I mean, he's signed the agreement together with the UK. But I mean, immediately after the signing, but also within the last few months, we've heard more and more criticism from within Rwanda, right? So either the opposition saying that, hey, maybe take care of our people first, because before you take on a policy like this. But it also, right? I mean, think about it from a personal perspective. You're you're basically telling someone not to come here. You're trying to scare them away, to deter them by saying that, hey, if you come here, we'll send you to this place. I mean, it's not like, right? It's not like they chose Switzerland and said, hey, if you come here, we'll send you to Switzerland.
No, and it's really bad because Rwanda has been positioning itself as you mentioned Switzerland, as Switzerland of Africa, right? As a very carefully constructed society, a very well organized society, a beacon of stability. And the Democratic Republic of Congo has something to say about that. But that's the way that Rwanda has tried to market itself. And it's been very successful in that, with investors from all around the world feeling comfortable in working with Rwanda because of that, because it is more stable than many of its neighbors, because it's a clearer policy. And now all of a sudden the message is, oh, you want to be punished? You're going to be sent to Rwanda, as if it's some kind of hellhole.
I mean, I have friends, right? So some work in the development sector and choosing Rwanda as kind of like an anchor within the African continent, and even others who said, well, no, one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and has been doing really well in the past few years. And as a foreigner or expat, right, one of those words we're not big fans of, you live a really good life there.
Yeah, and you can have conversations about the authoritarian nature or the democratic nature, depending on your angle, of the Kigali government, of Paul Kagame, and there are some questions surrounding that. He's been in power for a long time, but it is very clear that policymaking has been quite consistent, and that is important for a country like Rwanda. And yes, now because of this agreement with the UK, they're getting hundreds of millions of pounds and other types of cooperation with Britain, but the price that they pay from a reputational perspective is very high and goes directly against this hard work from the past few
Just
decades.
a minute ago, you mentioned already that right, Rwanda is a force for stability in the region, except that the Democratic Republic of Congo might have to say a few things about this. Last or 2 weeks ago, there was a basically town hall discussion in the United Kingdom, where the BBC invited basically policing minister Chris Philip onto their format. This happened on the 25th of April of 2024. And so this is a format where the audience can ask questions, right? And so this is exactly where the DRC comes in, because here we have someone from the DRC saying that, hey, Rwanda and the DRC are not good friends at the moment, right? There's actually a lot of fighting happening between the two of them, and this is what my family was basically fleeing from, and this is the reason why I'm here. In this situation, could it be that I would be sent back to Rwanda? That actually the player in the region that I am fleeing from. And let's just say that that Chris Phillip had an interesting response to it. Let's listen to it just now.
What's his name? Chris.
This is Chris, yes.
Yeah, Chris.
Chris Phil.
I come from a neighbouring country called Congo. If you know geographically, that is located right next door to Rwanda. And right now in Goma, there's a genocide going on, and there's such a big conflict going on with people from Rwanda. So, had my family members come from Goma on a crossing right now, would they then be sent back to the country that they're supposedly warring, Rwanda? Does that make any sense to you?
No, I think there's an exclusion on people from Rwanda being sent
They're
to
not
Rwanda.
from Rwanda, they're from Congo.
They're from
and
Congo.
They're supposedly warring these people from Rwanda. Are they then going to be sent to Rwanda if they came here on a crossing?
From
Congo? Yeah.
Would people be sent from... Well, I mean, Rwanda is a different country of Congo, isn't it? It's a different country.
Yes.
It is.
Yes. He's saying if they come from a war zone in Congo, would they then be sent to Rwanda? That's
Well,
the point he's making.
so there is a clause in the legislation that says if somebody would suffer, I think the phrase is serious and irreversible harm by being sent somewhere, they wouldn't be sent. So there is that safety mechanism built into the legislation.
Charles.
I mean, astonishing, right? It's a bit problematic, all the things that he just said there.
It's not just problematic, but it shows exactly what we've been saying before, that this is not serious policy. It's not made by serious people. You could hear, and if you watch the video, you can see that he hardly knows that Congo is a country. He hardly understands the question, because what, Rwanda, Congo, how are they related exactly? Isn't that the same? And hey, there are some safeguards and this and this and that. It shows the complete ignorance of the policymakers behind this whole idea. And that fits into this narrative, that this has nothing to do with good policy. From a British taxpayer perspective, this is bad policy, but it doesn't matter, because it's about political symbolism. It's about acting as if you're taking a stance against evil somehow. And in the meantime, you actually become evil yourself, right? You become ignorant evil. You become someone who takes a position that will have very destructive consequences for an awful lot of people without any knowledge to actually understand what you're doing.
And can you explain to our listeners what is the problem?
That's a very good keyword, all right? It will have a lot of very destructive consequences for a lot of people. Because, and this is something that we, especially when we're talking about abstract things like this, right, from a basically, from a concept perspective of the Western bubble, we always have to remember that these are human people, right, we're talking about, that these are human lives, and that if any of these flights are ever going to take off, then there will be someone from, I don't know, Albania, from Syria, from Morocco, on that plane who will be flown very far away from their own home country into Rwanda, a place that they didn't want to go to, because otherwise, why would it? I mean, they could have gone there. And this will have a terrible impact on their personal lives.
Yeah, we have gotten to a point that we talk about immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, as if they are not true human beings, and as if they're somehow criminal aliens who just want to steal our job and our money, or just are a major threat to our society, which statistically they're obviously not. And the result of that is that we do not understand that these kinds of conversations are about actual individuals who are now going to be suffering terribly after most likely already coming from a very traumatic background. These are people who ask for protection, ask for support, hold up their hands and say, please help me. and we essentially torture them. We basically say, you're going to go to a country that you don't know anything about. You're going to be locked up there. I mean, not in prison, but you're going to be there and you don't have any chance to go back to the UK. And you have to hope that legally we will do something about your plight. And yeah, this is going to create a lot of human hardship. And all those people who kind of are okay with this policy, who kind of feel comfortable with this policy, and certainly people like Chris Philp and Rishi Sunak and the politicians behind this policy, they are responsible for this. They need to be held accountable for this. They are the ones who are inflicting this human hardship on vulnerable populations.
And they've also opened the floodgates with this. Because yes, we're talking specifically about the United Kingdom here, but Denmark has already discussed basically adapting a similar policy if the UK were to succeed. And now, ahead of the European elections, well, so the elections for the European Parliament, the EPP, so the Conservatives within the Parliament, under, well, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, there's also some talk about, well, maybe we can implement a policy like this too, because, and right, that's the reasoning behind this, because they're worried about the rise of the far right. So because the far right is rising, we're going to implement a policy that only the far right would maybe propose before. What a great logic.
Yeah, and this is a known pattern, right? So if you take the language from the late 20th century of the very few far right parties that existed in Europe, and they were very small at the time, if you take that language and you compare it to the language being used now by mainstream politicians, central politicians, the language being used now by mainstream politicians is much worse than the extremist language that was used 30, 40 years ago by extremist parties, right? It shows how society has shifted. And all under this guise of, well, we are the reasonable ones, and in order to stay in power as reasonable ones, we're going to adopt the unreasonable language and the unreasonable policy from the extreme just to keep them out of power. It is, yeah, I mean, we already said this was going to be a ranty episode, but it's horrifying. It shows how far we've fallen as a decent society.
And ultimately, it does not solve any of the actual underlying problems that are causing that depression within the West, these problems that we have to deal with every day. I mean, it's not these 29,000 asylum seekers coming to the United Kingdom that are basically throwing the UK into chaos and turmoil. No, it's the other problems, the ones that we are actually not dealing with.
Exactly. So there are legitimate conversations to be had, of course, about how to deal with migration, immigration, how to deal with refugees, how to deal with asylum seekers, economic migrants. There are managerial questions, there are budgetary questions, there are administrative, legal questions. There are serious conversations to be had about migration, of course. But the future success or failure of Western society will not be determined by letting in more or less asylum seekers. The future success of Western society is about much bigger infrastructural, political, social conversations that have nothing to do with outsiders, have nothing to do with migration. And the more we obsess and focus about this symbolic conversation about how many migrants should be let in and how many asylum seekers are acceptable and whether they should be sent to Rwanda or not, is more time not being spent on actually dealing with the very real challenges and trying to create some kind of ambition and future for the West again, rather than being this grumpy old man, hiding behind his garden fence, trying to keep the youth out.
And what now?
So, I mean, we're trying to keep the youth out, right? We're this grumpy old man here. This grumpy old man will not be here in 10 years.
Yeah, in 10 years' time, I will buy all our listeners dinner if the Rwanda policy turns out to be a success. If it turns out that this policy will still be around in its current form. Because there are so many problems with the very design of the program. There are so many legal, financial, political issues with it that there's no way that in the long run this program turns out to be a success. Now, the problem is that even when this program will be changed or maybe be eliminated from UK policy, then it will once again have shifted the debate, right? But the future is not sending asylum seekers to Rwanda or anywhere else for that matter. It just doesn't make any practical sense.
Well, is there any way that we can find positivity again within Western society, right? Because I mean, it's I mean, if the solution is that we all need to be less depressed for policies like these no longer to exist, then sign me up.
Well, in many ways, this whole conversation about such Rwanda policies and other anti-migrant policies um, are a sign that that we are not positive about ourselves, right? We're not interested in being good people. We're not interested in being people who are a example for others to follow, who try to do the morally right thing. We are scared people. We are fearful people at the moment. And so if we want to find positivity in our societies, what we need to do is have a conversation not about how we can keep what we've got, but about who we want to be. What kind of society does the United Kingdom in the next 50 years want to be? What kind of society does Germany or Spain or the European Union want to be in the next 50 years? How can we be proud of ourselves? When will we be proud of ourselves? How can we feel that we are actually looking in the mirror and see a genuinely good society with a good impact on the world around us? And once we have that, then you will notice that the Rwanda policy wouldn't make any sense because it goes contrary to everything we tell ourselves about righteousness, about being morally decent and doing the right thing.
This seems like a great moment to end today's conversation on the United Kingdom's Rwanda policy. If you have any questions, comments, or you've heard a mistake that we've made throughout the episode, please make sure to send us an email to thewesternbubble@gmail.com, and we will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next week when we burst the Western bubble. That is it from my side. Boulder, which closing quote did you pick for us today?
I hope that any Christian listeners forgive me for quoting the Bible as a non-Christian, but there is no doubting that I am also a child of, if you like, Judeo-Christian culture because I grew up in it. And um, what you typically have, I even went to a Catholic school, and what you get at a Catholic school is that you get read all the beautiful verses of the Bible that talk about positivity, about good things, religion as a conduit for being better. And so I thought I will turn to the Bible, to the Old Testament, to remind ourselves of some very ancient truths. Specifically, I turn to Leviticus, which is a book that is probably one of my least favorites of the Old Testament, but it has this quote that I think is very applicable to this episode, from chapter 19, verse 34. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.